This is Summary of Philosophy, written by Nicolas Flamel, edited, introduced, and narrated by Robert D. Jones. General Introduction by Robert D. Jones. The Summary of Philosophy is a short alchemical work attributed to Nicolas Flamel. It was originally published as De la Transformation Métallique in Paris by Guillaume Guillard in 1561. Nicolas Flamel is one of the better-known alchemists of the pre-Paracelsus era and an individual that we are lucky enough to have some historic record for. He was a Parisian, born around 1330 and died on the 22nd of March, 1418. He spent the early part of his career as a scribe and manuscript seller who, as legend says, became phenomenally wealthy after he learned the art of alchemy from a Jewish converso while on the road to Santiago de Compostela in 1378. He reportedly made the Philosopher's Stone and the Elixir of Life after translating and practicing the teachings within the Book of Abramelin the Mage. However, this biography of Flamel was published nearly 200 years after his death in the Livre des Figures Hiéroglyphiques in 1612, and the validity of its accuracy is debated. In any case, there are several texts attributed to Flamel, including Flamel's Breviary, the Book of Washing, the Book of Hieroglyphic Figures, and the work you are currently reading, The Summary of Philosophy. The Summary of Philosophy is an alchemical masterpiece that uses alchemical and horticultural symbolism to describe the process of inner transmutation. The work sets out to describe the various aspects that make up an individual's psyche and how the alchemist is to apply this newfound knowledge to bring to fruition the purification of the self, or the production of the Philosopher's Stone. To begin, Flamel breaks down the components of the human psyche. He tells us that transmutation, or change, begins in the spirit, which is divided into two principles, the active conscious principle, sulfur, and the passive unconscious principle, quicksilver. Sulfur, or the conscious mind, is composed of fire, action, and air, thought. Quicksilver, or the unconscious mind, is divided into the earth, fertility or creativity, and water, emotion, which Flamel says, common gold, which is a perfect metal, and silver, and all the imperfect metals are developed out of mercury. If the various metals are synonymous with the various states of purification in an individual, then we see that these states are all developed through the unconscious mind, mercury or quicksilver. The tract tells us that mercury itself is made up of the moon and the sun, or that which is invisible to consciousness and that which is visible to consciousness. When these two principles are united, or once the conscious and unconscious mind are working together, they naturally begin to manifest, which Flamel describes in the following. When those two spirits have grown up and their two varieties of seed awake, they desire to assume their own proper bodies. According to Flamel, Mercury's initial manifestation, product, or coagulation will be lead, which we know to be the most base of the metals. We are warned, though, to not stop the process here, as the lead itself can be further improved upon. If we peer through the symbolism, we might see that as the student begins the alchemical process of the purification of self, we will inevitably first find that the initial product of our inner work will not be the perfection we hoped for, but a far baser and gross version of ourselves. However, Flamel likens this to unripe fruit that, if allowed time and further work, will continue to get better. He warns, as soon as you sever the connection with the parent Mercury, that growth of the grain must immediately come to an end. It is as though the unripe fruit had been plucked from the tree. As the student works through the alchemical process, a connection to the unconscious Mercury must be kept at all times. If we ignore the unconscious, the power for transmutation of the self is destroyed, and whatever product has been produced will be all there is. When you have once removed an unripe pear or apple from its native branch, it would be foolish indeed to join it to the tree once more and expect it to ripen. Instead of growing, it will gradually shrivel up and become smaller. Flamel continues his analogy of fruit trees and advises us that once we begin to see fruit or progress, we must change our physical circumstances to those that are more conducive of better growth. For example, if one is surrounded by toxic friends, then progress may demand that the individual leave them and find those with a brighter growth mindset. As the tree is analogous to Mercury, or the unconscious, we can also understand this as meaning one should stop feeding the unconscious mind with things that would poison it and begin to feed it with productive items. The unconscious is fed through the choices of the conscious mind, so one might consciously choose to begin feeding the unconscious with poetry and philosophy instead of the cheap media that is so common in society. Flamel says, "This tree we must transplant without gathering its fruit into a better and richer soil and to a sunnier spot. Then its fruit will receive more nourishment in a single day than it was wont to receive in 100 years while it was still in its former sterile soil." Again and again, Flamel tells us that Mercury contains gold and silver, which the Mercury can naturally grow and multiply. This is to say that we already have gold or perfection within us, and that we only need to feed the unconscious Mercury correctly to allow for natural growth, which eventually results in coagulation or manifestation. I wish you to understand that Mercury, which is a most excellent tree and contains silver and gold in an indissoluble form, must be taken and transplanted into a soil that is nearer to the sun, i.e., in this case, gold, where it may flourish exceedingly and be abundantly watered. Where it was planted before, it was so shaken and weakened by the wind and the frost that but little fruit could be expected from it, so there it remained for a long time and bore no fruit. Flamel gives us one final piece of advice before closing his tract. He tells us that the work is gentle, natural, and occurs in its own time, though this can be slightly quickened by the alchemist. He likens the work to that of the development of chicken eggs and says, "The preparation is so simple that it might be seen to by a woman while she works at her spindle, just as she might set a hen on some eggs without washing them first, and without any other trouble but that of turning the eggs every day that the chickens may break the shells all the sooner. If you do this, there will come out a chicken that will deliver you with its blood from all diseases, feed you with its flesh, and clothe you with its feathers, and shelter you from the cold." The symbolism here is that the chicken is the source of the gentle heat, symbolic of the active conscious attention we give to the process. The egg is the passive unconscious that is developing the product. And time is the natural process that can be sped up through applying the alchemical process, and the chick is the final manifestation, the coagulated product of the work. Flamel's tract gives a brief outline to the reader of how the human psyche is divided into various principles, namely the conscious and unconscious mind, which are in themselves made up of various parts. He then describes how these parts can be brought into conjunction so that over time and through proper cultivation, the work will conclude with the birth of the symbolic chicken. Frontispiece: A Short Tract or Summary of Philosophy by Nicolas Flamel. Summary of Philosophy. He that wished to understand the subject of metals and how one is transmuted into another should first find an answer to this question: from what substance do they come, and how are they formed in their ores? To answer this question, he must observe the changes that are continually going forward in the mineral veins of the earth. For this reason, metals may be made subject to transmutation outside of their ores if they are first made spiritual, so that they may be reduced to their sulfur and mercury, which is performed by nature. All metals have been formed out of sulfur and quicksilver, which are the seeds of all metals, the one representing the male, and the other the female principle. These two varieties of seeds are, of course, composed of elementary substances. The sulfur, or male seed, being nothing but fire and air, i.e. good sulfur resembling fire, free from the mutable properties of the metals, and not that common sulfur which is not a metallic substance at all, while the quicksilver, or female seed, is nothing but earth and water. These two seeds were figuratively represented by the ancient sages under the forms of the two dragons, or serpents, one of which had wings, while the other had none. The wingless dragon is sulfur because it never flies away from the fire. The winged serpent is quicksilver, which is borne away through the air. The female seed, which is composed of water and earth, because to a certain degree it flies away or evaporates. Now, if these two seeds, separated one from another, are united by triumphant nature in the Book of Mercury, the first mother of metals, the sages call the substance that results the flying dragon, because this dragon, being kindled with its fire, in its flight, pours abroad into the air fire and a poisonous vapour. The same happens to Mercury, which if placed in a vessel over an ordinary fire, has its internal hidden fire kindled, and then you may see how the outward vegetable fire kindles the inward natural fire of Mercury. You will notice that it exhales into the air a certain poisonous fume or vapour, the stench of which is such as to prove that it is nothing but the head of the dragon which is leaving Babylon in great haste, even the philosophical Babylon, which is encompassed by a double or treble vessel. Other sages have likened this Mercury to a flying lion, because the lion devours other animals and refreshes and strengthens himself at will with the blood of all animals, except those which have the power to resist his rage, and because Mercury, too, is known to deprive other metals of their specific form and to absorb and incorporate them. Gold and silver, however, are strong enough to resist its violence, although it is well known that Mercury, when exposed to an exceptional degree of heat, devours and swallows even these two metals. Yet these are not changed into the nature of the Mercury despite being enclosed in its womb. For gold and silver are more permanent and more perfect than crude Mercury, which is an imperfect metal. However, there is still the substance of perfection within the Mercury. Common gold, which is a perfect metal, and silver, and all the imperfect metals, are developed out of Mercury. For this reason, the ancient sages have called it the mother of the metals, and hence, being itself a metal, it must contain a twofold metallic substance, namely, the inner substance of the moon, and that of the sun, which is unlike the other. Of these two substances, Mercury is formed, and they are cherished in its body in the form of spiritual essences. Now, as soon as nature has formed that Mercury of these two spirits, she strives to transmute them into a perfect bodily form. Therefore, when those two spirits have grown up and their two varieties of seed awake, they desire to assume their own proper bodies. Then the mother, Mercury, must die, and having died a natural death, can never be quickened any more into that which it was previously. Vainglorious and arrogant alchemists have obscurely hinted that perfect and imperfect bodies must be transmuted into fluid Mercury. However, this assertion is only a trap for the unwary. It is true that Mercury consumes imperfect metals like lead and tin, and thus increases in quantity, but by doing so, it loses its perfection and is no longer the Mercury that it was before. If indeed it could be so mortified by a chemical process as to shut out all hope of ever quickening itself again, it would be changed into something else, as happens with cinnabar or in sublimate. But when it is coagulated by a chemical process, whether by a swift or a slow method, its two bodies do not assume a permanent form. By the natural process, this coagulation is indeed successfully carried out, and thus we never find a vein of lead, for instance, which does not contain at least a few permanent grains of gold and silver. The first coagulation of mercury is lead, which is most suitable for fixing it and bringing it to perfection, for lead is never without some fixed grain of gold and silver, which are imparted to it by nature for the purpose of multiplication and development, as I myself have experienced and can testify. So long as it is in its mercury and not separated from its mineral, it can continue to increase its substance from the substance of its mercury. But if this fixed grain is taken away and severed from its mercury, or the mineral in which it is found, it can no longer gain in size. It is with the grain as with the green fruit that is formed on a tree when the blossom has been shed. If it is plucked off before it is ripe, it can come to nothing. If it is left on a tree, it is nourished and increased by the sap and the juice of the parent stem, and thus gradually attains its proper size and maturity. But until ripeness has been attained, the fruit continues to attract to itself the sap and juice of a tree, that is to say, so long as the connection of the parent tree is not severed. Almost the exact same thing happens with gold. Such a grain attracts to itself the mercury of the lead and incessantly fixes it into its own mercury, whereby it grows and gradually increases in size. The mercury of perfect or imperfect metals is the parent tree, and the grain of gold can be nourished with nothing but this mercury. But as soon as you sever the connection with the parent mercury, that growth of the grain must immediately come to an end. It is as though the unripe fruit has been plucked from the tree, and an attempt to restore that vital connection would be in vain. When you have once removed an unripe pear or apple from its native branch, it would be foolish indeed to join it to the tree once more and expect it to ripen. Instead of growing, it will gradually shrivel up and become smaller. The same thing may be observed in the case of the metals. For if anyone were to take common metallic gold and silver and try to resolve those metals into mercury, he would be doing a very foolish thing. It is a result which cannot be brought about by any chemical process, however subtle and ingenious. Just as fruit, which has once been plucked in an unripe state, can never again be vitally joined to the parent tree. It has, indeed, been well said by the sages that if gold and silver be joined together through their proper mercury, they have the power to render all other imperfect metals perfect. But these sages did not speak of common gold and silver, which must always remain what they are, can never become anything else, and certainly cannot aid the development of other metals. It is fruit that has been plucked before the time and therefore is dead and withered. No, we must seek the living fruit, the real living gold and silver, on the tree, for it is only there that it can grow and increase in size according to the possibilities of its nature. This tree we must transplant without gathering its fruit into a better and richer soil and to a sunnier spot. Then its fruit will receive more nourishment in a single day than it was wont to receive in 100 years while it was still in its former sterile soil. I wish you to understand that mercury, which is a most excellent tree and contains silver and gold in an indissoluble form, must be taken and transplanted into a soil that is nearer to the sun, i.e., in this case, gold, where it may flourish exceedingly and be abundantly watered. Where it was planted before, it was so shaken and weakened by the wind and the frost that but little fruit could be expected from it. So there it remained for a long time and bore no fruit. But in the garden of the sages, the sun sheds its genial influence both morning and evening, day and night, unceasingly. There our tree is watered with the rarest dew, and the fruit which hangs upon the trees swells and ripens and expands from day to day. It never withers, but makes more progress in 1 year than it did in 1,000 years in its former sterile situation. Or to drop metaphor, let the mercury be taken and warmed day and night in an alembic over a gentle fire, yet it should not be a coal or a wood fire, but a clear and lucid heat like that of the sun itself. a gentle and even warmth. Growing fruit must not be exposed to too much heat, or else it is withered and shriveled up and is never brought to perfection. It must have a pleasant warmth and be supported by a moderate moisture in the tree if it is to flourish and expand. For heat and moisture are the food of all earthly things, both animal, vegetable, and mineral. Ordinary coal or wood fires are too violent for our purpose and give no nourishment like the heat of the sun, which preserves all bodies through its natural influences. For this reason, the sages use none but this natural fire, not because it is made of the sages, but because it is made by nature. Nature that creates all things, whether they be animal, vegetable, or mineral, and warms them, each at its own proper degree. Therefore, I will not say that man by his art can make natural things, but I do say that human art can impart greater perfection to that which nature makes. For this purpose, the ancient sages have had but one object in view, namely to produce from the moon and the true mother Mercury, the Mercury of the philosophers, which in its operation is much more potent than natural Mercury, and is useful for working upon simple, perfect, imperfect, cold, and warm metals. Now the philosophical stone is good for perfect and imperfect metals, and soon restores and brings them to perfection without any reduction, addition, or real change of any kind. For, apart from perfecting them, it leaves them in the state in which they were before. I do not say that the sages combine common gold, silver, and mercury for this purpose. This is the method only of ignorant charlatans, who thereby hope to prepare the mercury of the sages, but they never succeed in producing this, the real substance of a stone. If they would obtain it, they must go to the seventh mountain, where there is no plain, and from its height they must look down upon the sixth, which they will behold at a great distance. On the summit of that mountain they will find the glorious regal herb, which some sages call a mineral, some a vegetable. The bones they must leave and only extract its pure juice, which will enable them to do the better part of the work. This is the true and subtle mercury of the philosophers, which you must take. Now first, it prepares the white tincture, and then the red. For the sun and moon are prepared by the same method, and yield the red and white tincture, respectively. And the preparation is so simple that it might be seen to by a woman while she works at her spindle. Just as she might set a hen on some eggs without washing them first, and without any other trouble but that of turning the eggs every day, that the chickens may break the shells all the sooner. In like manner, you must not wash your mercury, but only put it with its like, which is fire, into ashes, corresponding to the straw, into one glass vessel, which is the nest, in a suitable alembic, which is the house. If you do this, there will come out a chicken that will deliver you with its blood from all diseases, feed you with its flesh, clothe you with its feathers, and shelter you from the cold. Therefore, I pray and beseech the Creator of all things to grant His grace to all faithful alchemists, that they may find the chicken, which, through God's unspeakable goodness and mercy, has now been vouchsafed to me. I have written this tract for your sakes, to encourage you, and to point out to you the right way. I hope and trust that my words will enable you to understand more fully the works of other sages. Farewell. Notes. Number 1. The dragon is a classic alchemical symbol and likely the most important in regards to allegory. It is the guardian of the stone and undergoes various transformations throughout the work. The winged dragon represents volatile mercury, whereas the wingless dragon represents its fixed state. In his Dictionary of Alchemy, Mark Hafner proposes that the process of killing the dragon, or fixing it to a solid state, is a prerequisite step to obtaining the Philosopher's Stone. Once fixed, the elixir is united with the feminine mercury through the stage of conjunction. Number 2. The Egyptians called lead the mother of metals, and regarded it as the prima materia due to it being black in colour and the first metal of the alchemical work. However, this was shifted in the Middle Ages to mercury when there was a greater focus on the duality of the masculine sulphur and feminine mercury, which is what Flamel is referring to. Number 3. The line has various symbolic attributes in alchemy based on how it is being represented. At its core, however, the line can be viewed as representing the base animalistic parts of man. See Jung's Mysterium Conjunctionis, which Flamel seems to agree with as he likens the line to rage. Number 4. The Mons Majorum Invisibilis, or the Invisible Magic Mountain, is an alchemical symbol that represents an internal idea. To climb a mountain takes a great deal of work and sacrifice, but once the summit is reached, an individual can look down and see the world from a higher perspective. As this is the 7th mountain, and there are 7 stages to alchemy, one can imagine that ascending the 7th mountain is to reach the peak of the alchemical process. From atop this mountain, the individual can collect the Philosopher's Stone. Number 5. The regal herb likely corresponds to the biblical tree of knowledge and life in the Garden of Eden. This image is a common alchemical symbol found in many alchemical images, some of which are printed in the Museum Hermeticum. One interpretation is that the tree brings life and happiness to the beholder. Carl Jung posits that the tree is symbolic of an individual's spiritual and psychological growth. See Jung's Mysterium Conjunctionis. This concludes our reading of Summary of Philosophy by Nicolas Flamel. If you have enjoyed this reading or have suggestions for future readings, please let me know in the comments section below. Don't forget to subscribe to be notified when new audiobooks become available. Bye for now.